Welcome to another episode of the Yalla podcast, the podcast of Jewish students, brought to you by the Union of Jewish Students of the UK and Ireland. I'm Emma. I'm the Campaigns and Holocaust Education Sabbatical Officer.
And my name's Ruby. I'm a third year politics and parliamentary studies student at the University of Leeds.
On today's episode, we are thrilled to welcome a leading expert in Holocaust education and a champion for preserving the memory of Jewish history.
We are very proud to be joined by Maws, who is the Head of Education and Heritage at the Association of Jewish Refugees. Alex plays a vital role in evaluating Holocaust education programmes across the UK and globally, collaborating with organisations such as UNESCO. He's also the producer and host of the AJR podcast about the Kindertransport, highlighting the stories of Jewish refugees who fled Nazi persecution.
Additionally, Alex is a member of the UK delegation of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, IRA, working with educators and policymakers worldwide to address Holocaust education and combat anti-Semitism. Before joining the AHR in 2017, Alex made significant contributions to Holocaust education as a part of the Holocaust Educational Trust, where he created their renowned ambassador programme.
Alex is a wealth of knowledge, and we're incredibly fortunate to have him with us today. Welcome to Yalla, the podcast of Jewish students, Alex.
Thank you, Ruby and Emma. It's great to be here.
Thanks for joining us.
So just to start off, would you be able to tell us a bit about how you found yourself working in Holocaust education, what brought you to this point, and what have been the highlights of your career so far?
Oh, wow. Okay. Starting off with a big one. It's interesting. I should say, you might be able to tell from my accent. I grew up in the United States. I'm from Boston, Massachusetts. Several years into my time working in the field of Holocaust education, it occurred to me I was never actually taught about the Holocaust when I was at school, and so it's really baffling how I ended up here, I suppose. I when I was young, I was raised, in the Reform Jewish movement, I suppose, but barely. I didn't have a huge, Jewish identity. It wasn't always sort of an aspiration that I would go to work in the Jewish charity sector or the Holocaust educational sector. I actually started my career as an environmental activist, and I enjoyed that quite a lot, actually. And but the money wasn't very good. And one time I saw a job advertised for a little bit more money that was basically doing the same sort of thing, which was like writing, campaign materials and things like that, but for a Holocaust educational organization. I thought, well, it's not really my issue, but sounds interesting enough. And that was an organization called Facing History and Ourselves, which is it's quite prominent in the United States. It's got some presence in other parts of the world, including here in the UK. And so I spent a few years working there, and my job was writing about all these cool programs that these educators and experts were delivering. And I thought, after a few years, I thought, this is so frustrating. I'm always writing about the interesting work that other people are doing. I want to do the educational stuff. I want to do the really interesting stuff. So that's when I moved to London in 2003. So a long time ago now. We got a master's in education. I taught for a few years here in East London, where I live. And then after a few years of that, a job opened up working at the Holocaust Educational Trust in the very early days of the Lessons from Auschwitz project, which many listeners might be familiar with. It's the program that takes sixth form students on one-day visits to Auschwitz-Birkenau. And so I worked at the trust on that project and then many others for 10 years. And then left that. And then now for the past 7 years, I've been working at the Association of Jewish Refugees, which it's important to say hasn't traditionally been an educational organization, but maybe we'll talk more about the AJR. We are very much looking to the future of the organization, and education is a big part of that.
Thank you. And so following on from that, I guess, how do you see the role of Holocaust education evolving, especially in the next decade and when we reach into the post-survivor age?
Well, it's important to say that Holocaust education is always evolving. For as long as people have been teaching and learning about the Holocaust, to use the jargon of the educational sector, the pedagogical approaches have been changing. The way we teach the Holocaust today is not the same as it was 10 years ago, 20 years ago, etc. And that's because our educational expertise, broadly speaking, changes, new sort of approaches and technologies emerge, and the way we teach about anything is likely to change. Our understanding of just sort of child development and lots of things change, but also because our understanding of history changes. The Holocaust, the book is not yet closed on the history of the Holocaust. We're constantly learning new things about it and reevaluating what needs to be taught in classrooms. The world around us is changing at the same time. Obviously, 20 years ago, this sort of questions about, and maybe we'll talk about this as well, but sort of misinformation online and that kind of thing, these were not big topics that we were confronting. So it's always been evolving, but for as long as I've been in this field, there has been this sort of looming sense of dread that one day we will find ourselves, as you said, in a post-survivor world when there are no longer living eyewitnesses to the events of the Holocaust. Now, we're not there yet, but it's pretty clear that the number of survivors is dwindling, and those who are available to go out and speak in schools or to community events and things like that is pretty small these days. And so the question is, how will the loss of these survivors affect our work in teaching and learning about the Holocaust? I I am sad whenever a survivor who I've worked with dies. Obviously, it goes without saying. It's tremendously sad to see that happen. From a professional point of view, I don't have this sort of same sense of dread that some people have, where we need to totally rethink what it is that we do. There are lots of historical subjects. I'm thinking about, for example, the transatlantic slave trade or something like that, that are taught very well. And they have no eyewitnesses, obviously no living eyewitnesses, but hardly any testimony accounts either. We have tens of thousands of testimony accounts that we can make use of. So the voices of the people who experienced and witnessed the events of the Holocaust are so accessible, and it's really for us to make use of them. But I also think we need to ask the question of, well, what do we mean, when we say a post-survivor world? Are we looking to sort of replace survivor testimony in a like for like fashion? Are we trying to say, well, we used to have survivors that would speak, and now instead of that, we're going to have, for example, the children of survivors or the grandchildren of survivors? That's one approach. Some people do that. It's got some benefits. Some people say, let's not just look at videos of survivor testimonies, but let's look at holograms of survivors that are almost lifelike in the room with you. And let's program AI question and answer, schemes where you can literally have a conversation with the survivor. That exists. It's out there. It's an interesting approach. I don't think it's the answer. I don't think there's any one answer. But I think the question is about just finding interesting ways of connecting young people, young learners, with history, making it personal. Maybe that's more site-based education. Maybe that's going to places. Maybe that's localizing the history. That's sort of connecting them to things close to their own homes and schools and communities that bring us into conversations about our own communities' connections to the Nazi era. I think there's lots of ways of approaching that question. There's a lot of smart people that are working towards it. So I don't have that sense of dread. I think, we're in a good place.
Thank you. And it's really interesting to hear you talk about, what might be able to replace these first-hand testimonies in future. I think another challenge that we have regarding Holocaust education is going to be some of the political shifts we're seeing at the moment. The United States is undergoing significant political shifts, and we're also seeing the rise of the far right in the UK and the rise of anti-Semitism globally. So what challenges do you think this will create in Holocaust education, and how might we tackle these?
So, I mean, this sort of brings us on to the topic of Holocaust distortion. And this opens a whole can of worms. I mean, we'll start with the the ways in which governments can sometimes make, they can utilize history to create narratives, or manipulate history, I should probably say, to create narratives that suit their own contemporary agendas. And we see it all the time. You've mentioned the United States. I mean, Yes, that's one example. We've seen it in recent years in Hungary, Poland, and these are just the sort of really prominent ones that relate to Holocaust era history, Lithuania. But I mean, you could look at all kinds of historical periods and episodes and different countries and how they've kind of ever so slightly shifted the narrative or the responsibility or the rehabilitating certain historical figures who they want to celebrate rather than hide from and these sorts of things. It's a problem. History should never be politicized. Obviously, it goes without saying, but that is much easier said than done. And this is where obviously the role of education comes into play. The challenge, of course, is that education is often, curriculums are often set by governments. So we have experts, institutions, and institutions around the world who are doing great work, in spite of the government of the country in which they operate. And so we really need to strengthen and embolden that so-called third sector, civil society to keep doing the good work that they're doing, so that it just means that these political influences that sometimes can, I mean, I'm hesitant to say it, but can distort history, are less likely to be successful.
Yeah. I guess looking at the most recent few days and what we've kind of been seeing floating around since the inauguration, I guess, do you think that social media and what we're seeing happen in front of our eyes, but also the way that social media perceives it, is likely to pose more of a threat in the coming years towards the memory of the Holocaust, but also towards really how we approach all sorts of discrimination?
I mean, the short answer is yes. I do think that social media poses a threat and is likely to pose a greater threat. Um, I, I don't have any easy answers about what to do about that, other than not entirely ceding the space, but at the same time, not not encouraging platforms, let's just call them out. Obviously the biggest offender probably is X, Meta not distinguishing themselves with recent sort of changes to their service, TikTok not distinguishing themselves. Um, and so, there are interesting questions. The Association of Jewish Refugees, where I work, we led a campaign, just at the end of 2024, to encourage other organizations in the Holocaust remembrance and education sector to collectively, en masse, leave X and silence our accounts and basically say we are not going to feed that content monster anymore, because it has become a platform, not just because I might have a personal objection to Elon Musk's politics, and we can get onto him in just a moment, or whatever, but because of what he has done to this platform, which has made it a site that is just rife with abuse and misinformation. And I don't want to subject myself to that. I don't want to subject my colleagues who, post on behalf of our organization to that. And I don't want that company to be encouraged because they profit from our content. We provide our content to them for free. The whole platform relies on people giving it content that it disseminates around through the algorithm to whoever it's going to boost it to. And I hope that, they go out of business the way they currently exist. So I don't want to encourage their business success by posting content there. That said, there's an interesting argument to be made of, well, if that happens, does it not just turn into, an even worse ecosystem? And it probably will. But there are lots of, really problematic, very far right social media platforms out there that most people just don't engage with. Advertisers don't want to have any part of it. Sort of rational minded people don't want to be on there. And hope that if, Twitter doesn't actually go out of business, maybe it'll just become irrelevant. Sorry, X. And so that's the direction of travel there. I should say that literally just yesterday, so 2 days ago, as we're recording this, was when the news broke about Elon Musk giving a Nazi salute at a Trump rally. Okay. Have you seen this? Have you watched the video? Both of you? Okay. It, I suppose before I go any further, do either of you have any doubts about whether he gave a Nazi salute?
Not at all.
I don't think it matters whether he did or he
Okay.
didn't.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, in so many things, when we talk about just sort of like, offensive language or whatever, we always talk about it's about impact, not intent, right? And so if millions of people saw that as a Nazi salute, well, then just apologize, right? Like you could say I didn't mean it as a Nazi salute, but just apologize. Just, apologize for the offense that you caused. He's not willing to do that. He's laughing it off and all the things. It is worth saying that some organizations in our field have not, I don't think that they have covered themselves in glory in their responses to this. The AJR, where I work, we released a statement yesterday. We went there, and basically, we're an organization that was founded by Holocaust survivors and refugees. Many of them are still alive. And so our statement said something to the effect of the members of the AJR can speak with some experience on this topic. When someone makes a fascist salute who has a history of promoting anti-Semitic content, let's not waste time debating the meaning of it. It's offensive to the memory of those who have firsthand experience witnessing those salutes and what follows on from it, and to the memory of people who were murdered by those same fascist ideologies. And it's interesting. We posted that on a Meta platform on Instagram, just the text of it. And I just had one look at it. I was at a restaurant last night. I was just scrolling on my phone, and we're getting a lot of abuse. Now, I think a lot of it's from bots. And interestingly, you can see that a lot of people who are, take it upon themselves to say how disappointed they are in the AJR aren't actually people who followed the AJR on Instagram. So it's one of these things where the algorithm found it and just started, pushing it out there to people, to generate some controversy or whatever it aims to do. And so it's fascinating that you can have millions of people on social media. We didn't have millions of comments, but who are basically saying that what we saw with our own 2 eyes, 6 eyes in the case of this podcast, didn't happen. We're wrong. That's shocking. And so there's a big open question about how people who care about protecting history, protecting the facts, can use these platforms to be a place of I don't know, is education, I suppose, of truth. It's a battle, but I think we need to stay engaged in it.
Yeah, I think the statement was really powerful, and it definitely what's happened on social media recently really raises questions about how we can reach large numbers of people with education, and considering social media is now where so many people get their news from, when that becomes a platform for misinformation and distortion of history, how do we reach people in the same way? Can you talk a bit about that and what work AJR is doing on education and just more generally?
Absolutely. So just to say a little bit about the AJR, I mentioned earlier. So we were founded in 1941 by then refugees from Nazism, mostly from Germany and Austria in the early days. Many people don't know this, that if they know anything about Jewish refugees from Nazism, they might know about the Kindertransport, 10,000 children who came to Britain from Germany and Austria mainly. But actually, about 70,000 Jewish refugees came to Britain before the war, from, say, 1933 to 1939, from the rise of Hitler to the outbreak of war. And through various different, visa schemes and whatever opportunities they could grasp hold of, and made their way here in various professions and things like that. By 1941, there was widespread suspicion about anyone who sounded German, who came from Germany, and Winston Churchill issued the edict to collar the lot, to round up all of the so-called enemy aliens, and included in that were thousands of Jewish refugees who were starting to feel a little bit aggrieved. Some of them were sent to internment camps because they were considered to be enemy aliens. They were a threat to the country because they were German. Someone didn't quite figure out that actually, if they're fleeing from the Nazis as Jews, they're probably not likely to be very sympathetic to the Nazis. But so in 1941, they established a association of Jewish refugees to, advocate for their interests. And in the early days, that work involved, teaching them English and finding jobs and gaining citizenship. As our members have aged over the decades, the ways we've supported them has changed as well. We now have elder care social workers, and we have, trips to the seaside and that kind of thing. But increasingly, we're looking to the future of the organization. And going back to what we talked about earlier, what will the AJR do? What will we stand for when there are no longer refugees and survivors from Nazism with us? And so the educational work is a big part of the future of the organization. We mostly get involved in education by funding. We are a grant funder of dozens of educational initiatives around the UK. So we only support UK-based projects, and we support a number of different projects, from really big ones, the big sort of museums and institutions that you will possibly have heard of, and to small little local ones, a community Holocaust Memorial Day event in, on the Norfolk coast or something like that. So we try to not just support education by funding these things, but by bringing people together. We're a very active funder in that way. We like to sort of share our expertise and our guidance and our advice, but also encourage all of our network of funding partners to share their expertise with one another. It's worth saying there's a really thriving field of Holocaust education and commemoration in Britain, but it's often quite siloed. There's not a lot of opportunities where the organizations actually cooperate with one another. And the AJR really encourages that cooperation so that there's there's a minimal unnecessary overlap and that sort of thing. So we are trying to, use that role as a funder to encourage, to promote good practice. And what we mean by good practice is largely set by the sort of guidelines of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, which I'm happy to talk more about if that's of interest. And yeah, so that's a little bit about our educational work. We produce a few of our own sort of online and other resources as well, but which we can talk about, but largely we leave it to the experts, the Holocaust Educational Trust, the National Holocaust Center and Museum, UCL in London, Imperial War Museum, to sort of do the good work that they're doing.
That's really interesting. Thank you. You did mention IRA, so I think it would be good now if you could tell us a bit about your global work with IRA, and I know you work with other organizations like UNESCO. Can you talk about what you do with them, and what are some of the challenges that exist around fostering global consensus on Holocaust education, especially in countries with different historical narratives and that have had a different direct experience with this history? Because in Britain, we did have lots of refugees come over, and we have lots of people who can directly share those stories, but that's not the same all around the globe. So can you talk about that a bit?
Definitely, and you've framed the question very well, because you've pointed out that there's this sort of tension. On the one hand, the Holocaust is a global historical event. Yet at the same time, there are very distinct national strands to that history, and we need to figure out, how do we How do we successfully capture all of that? So I will say that when it comes to sort of the core principles of teaching and learning about the Holocaust. And you'll notice I keep using that phrase, teaching and learning about the Holocaust rather than Holocaust education. That's my preferred phrase, and others in our field as well. I'm trying to move everyone in that direction. Um, there are some core principles that are universal that really don't, in terms of just how to teach about this sort of emotive and sensitive topic in all of its nuance and complexity at a way that is appropriate, age appropriate, educationally appropriate. And a lot of that guidance really, it doesn't matter from one country to another. But part of the guidance does also recommend looking through a national or even more local lens. So the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, sometimes referred to as the IRA, the IHRA, or whatever, is an intergovernmental body that today consists of 35 member countries and a few permanent international partner organizations like UNESCO and the UN and a few others. That is each year a different country holds the presidency of it. This year, as we speak right now, it is currently still under the UK presidency, so it's our year. Next year will be Israel. And starting in March, I should say. And it gathers together experts at the sort of, the NGO or civil society level. So people like me who work for charities, a lot of people who work for museums or in academia, or maybe they're sort of at the policy level of government. And it brings that expert level together with the diplomatic level. So each country sends a head of delegation who is a diplomat. Our head of delegation right now is Lord Pickles, Eric Pickles, who is not a traditional diplomat. He doesn't come from the world of diplomacy. He's a politician. He's a career politician, which is a little bit rare in the world of the IRA. But it is worth saying he's very passionate about these issues, and he loves holding other countries to task when they have something to be held accountable for. So it's an interesting mix of experts and diplomacy. People, each country that signs up to become a member of the IRA sort of commits to a statement that affirms their commitment to Holocaust education, research, and remembrance. And it's very interesting, to see what that means in these different national contexts. Probably what the IRA is most famous for is managing to get an international consensus from these 35 member countries on a working definition of anti-Semitism, which is fairly well known, I think, at this point in Britain. If people know about the IRA for anything, if they know one thing about the IRA, it's probably the working definition of anti-Semitism. In 2018, there was a whole sort of what are we calling it? Debate about anti-Semitism in the Labour Party and whether they would adopt the IRA definition of anti-Semitism or not, and became a real hot button issue, so that suddenly people out there in the streets who had never heard of IRA before suddenly had an opinion about it and the working definition of anti-Semitism, which I found all that very surreal, but there you go. But there's much more to IRA's work than just the working definition of anti-Semitism. For example, I sit on the education working group, as well as the Committee on Anti-Semitism and Holocaust Denial. But in the educational working group, we have produced international guidance on, or recommendations, it's called, on teaching and learning about the Holocaust. And so it gives really clear guidance on both why to teach about the Holocaust, what to teach about the Holocaust, and how to teach about the Holocaust. And these things are all interlinked. But some of the universal principles that aren't particularly nationally specific would be, avoiding, perpetrator image, photographs and dehumanizing images that tended to be taken by Nazis for propaganda purposes. Don't use those to try and teach about the Holocaust. Try to humanize the victims, a sort of names, not numbers approach to teaching about the Holocaust by telling individual stories that illuminate the bigger picture, but also at the same time to humanize the perpetrators and bystanders, to reinforce that the Holocaust was not, this sort of mythical historical event that was perpetrated by unthinkable monsters that we can't relate to. And, in so doing, we're trying to just find ways of making this a topic that uh, isn't necessarily like other things in the curriculum, that acknowledges that there's a lot of m moral questions, ethical questions, to use the phrase that comes up a lot in Holocaust education, these so-called choiceless choices, and that it takes it engages the brain of the learners in a different level than maybe other topics in their history or their RE or their English or their citizenship classes might, and that all requires a lot of, I shouldn't say a lot of expertise, some amount of expertise, specialist learning from their teachers, that it takes training to do that. So a big part of the work of lots of the organizations that have an affiliation with the IRA is helping to ensure that teachers are well trained and well resourced to do this work.
Thank you.
And in the UK, do you think that our current approach to teaching and learning about the Holocaust in schools is effective, or what do you think we maybe could be doing to improve it and to ensure that all children and young adults are effectively learning about what happened and what they can do to, stop anti-Semitism in the
Yeah.
future?
So I'll say every few years, a survey comes along that shows how many gaps in the knowledge of either young people or the greater public in the UK, how bad that situation is and how little we know about the Holocaust and that sort of thing. I should say that one such study is being released today, and I have some of the findings in front of me. And I always take a little bit of exception to this because I feel like, one, it's meant to be headline grabbing, it's meant to be clickbait. Look at how morally outrageous it is that we do this. I do wonder about these findings, like, well, to what extent do they ask, what people know about anything? Is the Holocaust uniquely, is it unique in the sort of lack of understanding or knowledge about it? Or is it like just a kind of a universal truism of education that you teach things and people also forget things that they've learned? I think that's probably likely to be the case. And I take some exception with trying to shame teachers or, dare I say, even organizations like our own, that we're not doing a good enough job. We're doing so much work to get this right. And so many people, as I say, are doing all that work. Their understanding of what is right, what works, is constantly evolving. And I don't think that sort of shaming and pointing fingers is the right approach. That having been said, obviously, we can always do better. I would like people to know more about the Holocaust than they do. Whether that's because we're not currently doing a good enough job, or it's just there's always more to learn. There's always better approaches to consider. You can decide. I always look at the challenges that we face as not being specific to the Holocaust educational sector, but rather broader educational challenges. The educational system is not set up to teach about complex histories like this. It's not set up to teach about the Holocaust. We shoehorn it in a lot, but it's sort of, square peg, round hole, or whatever the cliche is. So, for example, there's a national curriculum in England that says you must teach about the Holocaust in Key Stage 3 history. And that's great. It has been a compulsory mandated topic on the national curriculum for as long as there has been a national curriculum, since 1991. And that's great. But it doesn't say anything about what to teach. It doesn't say about what resources teachers are going to use. It doesn't say how much time to dedicate to it. It doesn't say how teachers are expected to learn how to do this, right? So I would like to see so much more space for that in the educational system. Teachers right now hardly ever go on CPD training courses. It used to be the norm that you would get a few days off a year when I was a teacher. You could go to a CPD course and learn something to improve your practice. It hardly ever happens now. Teachers, one of the programs we sponsor from the Holocaust Educational Trust is a 4-day long residential course where they learn about all the details of Holocaust pedagogy. They do it during their half-term break. Teachers spend their half-term break, 4 days on their half-term, sitting in a conference room in Leicester, learning about the Holocaust. I mean, what world is it that we live in where that's the expectation of teachers? That's insane. But also, on a deeper level, the Holocaust involves, some prior knowledge of Jews. I don't want, for young people, for their first introduction to Jews to be genocide, right? And it also requires some knowledge of anti-Semitism. It's important that they don't think that Nazis like invented anti-Semitism, that it didn't exist before the Holocaust. And so ideally, those concepts would have already been introduced at some points earlier in the curriculum. But as I say, the curriculum isn't developed, isn't structured so that we can be methodical like that. At, year, 3, we're going to introduce Judaism, and at year 5, we're going to introduce Judaism, but then they're going to also understand about historical anti-Semitism. At year 7, we're going to sort of get into the nuances of, Jewish identity, where Judaism is more than just a religion. At year 9, then we get to the Holocaust that builds on all of those things, or something like that, right? It just isn't set up for that. And so a lot of the challenges about teaching and learning about the Holocaust in the curriculum are ones where it's just like, we're doing our best in a flawed environment.
Yeah. Following on from that, I think I I guess I was in a lucky position going to a Jewish school my whole life and having kind of an abundance of Holocaust learning and opportunities handed to me. Looking back on some of those, at the time, maybe they were great. Now looking at them, I think maybe that wasn't the best approach. Asking a year 4 to bring in a suitcase of what they would bring if they were on a train leaving their family, maybe no longer the right approach. But I still remember that as my introduction to learning about the Kindertransport. And while for me that has been a positive experience going forwards, not the same for everyone.
Yep.
And I think, it's always person by person. Some people benefit from a trip to Poland. Some people find going on a trip to Poland is something they never ever want to go on again because it's so traumatizing. But looking at the education sector and where these limits are you're talking about and these restrictions, they're seeing that a lot of teachers and schools are relying on books and media and things that have been created on topics of the Holocaust. Some of those based on true stories, some of them really wonderful, some not so. And especially in like the key stage 3 curriculum, which is I think it's on the English curriculum, is the boy in the striped pajamas. So my question is, is there a place for works of fiction as an educational tool? But then also, what role does some works of fiction have in Holocaust distortion? And I guess the negative effects of what introducing these themes and topics in the wrong context can lead to.
So the short answer to the question of is there a role for fiction is yes. I think it would be weird if we said the Holocaust is the one topic in the entire course of human history that you're not allowed to you're not allowed to represent in fiction. That having been said, it is the one topic in the course of human history that has an extraordinary number of firsthand accounts of testimonies from survivors and eyewitnesses. And I'm not just talking about the recorded ones that we referenced earlier, but books, So my first, question when schools are seeking a book to read about the Holocaust is, I'm not saying don't read fiction, but have you considered a firsthand account of nonfiction? That having been said, there are some examples. The Holocaust Educational Trust has published a guide for English teachers that gives some recommendations about some works of fiction that are, for different ages throughout the curriculum that can lend themselves to conversations, in the classroom that that get at the key issues and also look at what is fictionalized and what isn't. Ideally, this would be a cross-curricular approach where they would work in cooperation with, say, the history teacher down the corridor, and they could kind of, have those lessons side by side. So, the fictionalized elements aren't the sum total of what they're quote unquote learning about the Holocaust. That brings us to the boy in the striped pajamas, which is, if you ask anyone in the Holocaust educational sector, you will probably get some version of the answer that I'm about to give you, which is it is a distortion and it has no place in education. Um, if there are some examples of fiction that are acceptable, this is not one of them. The problems with that book and I suppose the film, although I don't think I've ever actually seen the film, I don't think I need to, is that it presents a world which simply did not exist. So it's not just inventing a character, it's inventing a scenario where a young boy arrives at Auschwitz-Birkenau and is not murdered, right? Okay, well, that already, just from page one, that is not something that happened. Someone who is the age of that character who arrived at Auschwitz would have been murdered upon arrival. And then they create the scenario where he somehow befriends the son of the commandant. Okay, well, that wouldn't have happened. And that the son of the commandant had no understanding of what was going on there. Well, that wouldn't have happened. He would have been schooled in the Nazi educational system. He would have had all of the myths and stereotypes about Jews in his head, and so on and so on. And then the end. Sorry, spoiler alert. Stop the podcast if you really don't want to know what happens at the end of The Boy in the Striped Pajamas. But we can just get this over with right now. You don't have to read it. They both die in the gas chamber. The German boy die, it's sort of written as though the Jewish boy dies because, well, that's what happens to Jewish boys. The German boy dies tragically because that isn't meant to happen to German boys. So it's like, as David says, or the historian David Cesarani once wrote, it's like as though it's a bizarre health and safety lesson about looking after your children and not letting them get too close to the gas chamber lest they accidentally fall into it and die. We're meant to sympathize with the character who's the son of the perpetrator. Which is to say, an entire generation of young people have, quote unquote, and I'm saying this in very exaggerated speech quotes, learned about the Holocaust from that. And if what you think the Holocaust is based on the universe of The Boy in the Striped Pajamas, then you don't know what the Holocaust is. Some might say, well, it gets young people interested in learning more. And I hope that's true. But if your starting place, the first thing that you learned about Auschwitz is just a fundamental distortion of what Auschwitz was and how it operated, that's a lot of unlearning and relearning that needs to be done.
Yeah, thank you. I think I had a very different experience at school to Emma because I went to a non-Jewish school and I did learn about and have to read Boy in Striped Pajamas as part of our English lessons. And I think it's a bit upsetting that the only significant bit of Holocaust learning that I remember receiving at school was that book. And I found it uncomfortable for all the reasons that you've just laid out, which I think everyone will understand. And I do agree. I think there's a real challenge in making enough space in the curriculum for coherent Holocaust learning, especially in making sure that people don't just learn about it as a one-off unit and therefore see it as an isolated event that came out of nowhere, if they don't have that historical understanding of the wider context around it. I think that's something that really needs to stay at the forefront when we think about how Holocaust education is taught in schools. I know the government is really trying to expand right now Holocaust education and making sure that this bit of the national curriculum has to be taught in all schools because previously academies and independent schools were exempt from this, and Holocaust education is still not compulsory in Scotland and Wales. So that's hopefully an important focus
Yes,
of
and by the way, and I very much
education.
support the effort of the government to expand that because there is this big loophole about free schools and academies. It was a little bit weird under the last government where they were at the one hand saying, "Here's the national curriculum, you must teach these things," but then they were at the same time expanding the number of schools that were free schools and academies, which were not bound by the national curriculum. So it's like, well, which is it? Do you want them to teach it or not teach it? But at the same time, just going back to what I said earlier, if they are going to say it must be taught, I would love to see a little bit more guidance around what that actually means, because otherwise it's so up to interpretation. There are teachers who I'm sure they're not doing this because they want to avoid teaching about the Holocaust, but they're busy. They've got a lot of other things to teach, etc. They might spend 3 lessons on the Holocaust. What are you going to learn of value in 3 lessons? So I'd like to see a little bit more. Watch.
And also, when we talk about a sort of coherent overview in education, how do you think, respond to criticism that we get about Holocaust education sometimes, that it can be that it sometimes doesn't engage with the complexities of Jewish identity, and it can kind of only focus on victimhood rather than Jewish life, culture, identity, and resilience?
Well, I mentioned earlier about, the sort of internationally recognized guidelines in teaching and learning about the Holocaust. And certainly one of them is to start with pre-war Jewish life. You don't start, at the gates of Auschwitz or something like that, or even the Warsaw Ghetto. You have to understand a little bit about who Jews were, what Jewish communities were, to then understand what it was that was lost. Otherwise, we're just talking about kind of conceptual, these mythologies or whatever. Um, and so, at a minimum, you should start with a lesson on pre-war Jewish life. As I said earlier, ideally, some of that would have happened already earlier in the curriculum. So you don't have to take away one of your valuable 3 or 5 or whatever hours that you've got to teach about the Holocaust on that. But certainly talk about that, and then go on to to tell the stories of the people who became victims on ideally as individuals, not talking about 6 million, talking about this one person who lived in this particular shtetl or whatever their backstory is, to paint a picture. So that's very much, I think that's very important. And I would like to believe that the work of so many of our partner organizations out there that are, as I said earlier, training teachers, that they are reinforcing that point a lot. But again, there are far more teachers probably out there in the country who have not had the opportunity to engage in one of these courses than those who have.
Thank you. We've talked a lot about school teaching and learning, which is great. But moving on to we're students on campus. Many students today, in a context of rising anti-Semitism, which is seen in especially large numbers, unfortunately, on campuses, students sometimes feel very isolated and alone in fighting this. What role do you think Holocaust education can play in fostering allyship between Jewish and non-Jewish students?
Well, it's interesting that you pose that question where you've connected sort of anti-Semitism and Holocaust education, which is it's kind of a contested connection there. To what extent is it the role of Holocaust education to fix anti-Semitism? I mean, it certainly would be problematic if people, having learned about the Holocaust, emerge from those lessons more anti-Semitic. But as the author Dara Horn, I don't know if you've read People Love Dead Jews. Okay, you're both nodding your head, yes. She wrote a subsequent article that's not in the book that came out a year or two ago in, I think, Atlantic Monthly magazine. And the title of it was uh, has Holocaust education made anti-Semitism worse? Which is a troubling and provocative, but possibly important question to pose. Have we, by sort of putting the Holocaust in a box, making it so unique and treating it with this historical distance and reverence that people can say, well, whatever I see here on my campus or whatever, at least it's not the Holocaust. That was proper anti-Semitism. This, oh, let's not worry so much about that, or something along those lines. So I think that Holocaust education, look, it at the end of the day, the Holocaust was a global event. Let's be clear about what the Holocaust was. This is not of course we have to acknowledge that the primary victim group of the Nazis were the Jews. And I'm not trying to de-Jewify, so that's probably not a word, the history of the Holocaust at all. I always emphasize, you have to be very specific about that in teaching and learning about the Holocaust. But let's remember what the Holocaust was. In the modern world, in the heart of so-called Western civilization, across an entire continent, neighbors were complicit in the murder of their neighbors. If we are not educating about that fundamental truth of the world that we live in, and we do still live in the Holocaust world, then what are we educating about at all? Because that ultimately is something that binds us all together. And it's important to say that the response to that fundamental truth that I just described across the entire world was that pretty much every country in the world turned its back on those Jews when they were at their most desperate and vulnerable. And so no one comes out of this looking good. And that is something that is not particular to any one ethnic group, any faith group, social class, nationality, you name it. This is something that really does have universal resonance. The questions that the Holocaust asks us to grapple with, demands that we grapple with, are ones that should be universal. And so I would hope that on campuses, I know the world is a very difficult place right now, and college campuses in some ways are the epicenter of the ideological battles. But hopefully, the Holocaust is something that doesn't have to get dragged into this. It does sometimes, but it doesn't have to. And maybe, as you suggest, it could be something that is, in some ways, helps to unite us.
Yeah. And when we at UJS deliver anti-Semitism awareness training to student unions, to vice chancellors, to students, we always talk about the Holocaust, but kind of in a way of, we're not going to touch on this for too long, because how can you talk about anti-Semitism without talking about the biggest example of it that there is? But it's not beneficial to you for us to talk about death camps and, systematic murder for too long, when what we're talking about are smaller examples of the kind of thing we've been seeing for hundreds, if not thousands of years, just taking on a new form. And kind of explaining that, the Holocaust is the biggest example of anti-Semitism we can talk about, but universities at the time weren't, null of these kinds of examples, that universities at some points were actually the places where, they kind of helped to start. And it's really interesting because students are facing such difficult times, Jewish students today. And I was in Vienna a couple of weeks ago, and I was learning about the university in Vienna. I think is it just the Vienna University, one of them, and that they, the way that the university was kind of it was closed for 6 or 7 weeks, cleansed of its Jewish academics and students, in order to make it this, rich place of Nazi learning. And even now today, they don't refer to Hitler by his name, as kind of this sort of revenge on
Okay.
history. I found this out through
Interesting.
a tour guide.
Yeah.
Yet at the same time, universities are still places, no matter where we look in Europe, that are troubling for Jewish students.
Yeah.
And at times somewhere to find yourself politically engaged. And that we would encourage, political engagement for the first time for some people, because it's the first time you're really experiencing life outside of your home and the environment you're in, and you can kind of become your own person with your own thoughts. But
Yeah.
some of those can be dangerous. And I guess if we look at camp as this kind of microcosm of society, um, anti-Semitism is at its highest, but also with that is Holocaust inversion. And we're seeing quite a lot of Holocaust inversion in a way that makes it very uncomfortable for Jewish students to kind of defend themselves.
Yeah.
And I guess, what is your, I guess, advice to Jewish students as to um what you would suggest to them when facing issues of Holocaust inversion?
Mm. Well, I mean, I'm not sure that you need to invite an old guy onto a UJS podcast for me to give advice to students. I mean, you guys are doing amazing work in this space already, so I don't know that I have the best advice on this. But I mean, I think your point um, about Holocaust inversion is such an important one. If you ask people, you know, about whether they support the concept of Holocaust distortion, of course, they're going to say no. Like I believe in historical accuracy and the truth. But of course, these days, there's very few people that in mainstream discourse who deny that the Holocaust happened, right? That's not really the state of Holocaust denial and distortion these days. Distortion takes so many subtle forms. We've touched on a couple of them already about sort of rehabilitating, historical figures and rewriting historical narratives and, in sort of subtle ways that just try to have an agenda. And this point about Holocaust inversion that you make is another example of that. The idea of accusing Jews of being Nazis, that's the inversion that you're talking about, right? Now, it is the ultimate insult. I mean, it also, there's, it's nonsense. Obviously, there's no, history to it, but historical evidence of it, obviously. But that's hardly the point. The point is it's designed to be an insult. It's designed to offend. Almost every Jewish person that or any non-Jewish student knows will have relatives who either fled from Nazis or who were murdered by Nazis. Almost every Jewish person in the world has some family connection to that historical period. And so it is a particular insult, not just to to the historical accuracy, but to individual living Jews alive today who might be in your same course in your halls of residence or whatever. Um, and to what extent do they realize that? Do they realize that when you make some connection to let's say what we're talking about, I think Israel are behaving like the Nazis here. Well, you know, what are you getting at here? I know that invoking the Holocaust or Nazis in any argument is meant to be the ultimate mic drop because once you go there, there's nowhere else to go. But if you care about whatever your issue is, maybe it's the plight of Palestinians, maybe it's just thinking of other other things that people compare to the Holocaust or Nazism. That if you allow the government to take your guns, it's like what the Nazis did. People talk about abortion, or they compare that to the Holocaust. They compare sort of various sort of border crises and these sorts of things. You know, if you've said that, then you're basically saying, I don't actually want to engage in the substance and the nuance and the complexity of this issue. I just want to score cheap points at the expense of fact and accuracy. And that should be an embarrassment to anyone that's, if you care about whatever your issue is enough That's the card that you play. It should be an embarrassment. Um, and the fact that it is a done as a personal slur, I think is makes it all the more egregious. Now, you asked for advice. I'm not sure that I have it, but here's the thing that I would say in sort of this or any kind of situation along these lines, which is that you're probably not going to appeal to people on the level that I just did. But you can use I statements. It's like when you say that to me, I it hurts me because my grandmother fled from the Nazis and her brother was murdered or whatever the thing is. I feel like ultimately, universities are places of human connection. That's why those 3 or however many years you spend there are quite so amazing, right? It's not about what you do in your learn about in your lectures or whatever. It's a little bit, but it's the social experience. So bringing it back to the social element of it, to the human element of it, I feel like is the way that we can get past this. I hope. But I would love to hear what you think because I would love to be able to transmit your knowledge to other people who ask me that sort of question.
Maybe we should ask Ruby as our resident student.
Yeah.
I think it's a really difficult but interesting discussion. It definitely goes back to when we talk about people using how we can sort of make sure that it's not used to just score political points and for a politicized interpretation of history. I think in a lot of cases, it's not excusable, but I think people use these arguments to try and get sympathy because they're trying to highlight that something they care about is maybe inhumane, or they're trying to highlight violence that they're seeing. And I think in a lot of cases we have to say, yes, we understand that what we're seeing is awful. I do sympathize with what you're saying about this issue that you care about. However, and then talk about maybe your personal experience or why specifically comparing things to the Holocaust is so offensive and how it can be seen and like how it is anti-Semitic. Because I think I think it's people sometimes do it maliciously, but not in all cases. And that's kind of important to understand if you want to have a conversation with someone about it.
Yeah. By the way, I think that what you said is great. And I remember, reading a few months ago when, in America, there's, Thanksgiving is, holiday in November. And it's when a lot of families have, big, feasts together. And there was an article about how to talk rationally to your Trump supporting relatives. And it was sort of similar advice. It's like validate their feelings. That must be really scary for you to hear that information or something like that. I think that's really, really good. And I mean, I think you're also right. Like first of all, I don't believe when it comes to sort of anti-Semitic language and anti-Semitism generally, I think it's important to remember a few things. That I think you're right that most people do not identify as anti-Semites. They would not say I'm trying to be anti-Semitic. They probably do not realize all the nuances of anti-Semitism and Holocaust distortion and inversion, and this is an example of it. And I or Emma or anyone else would be happy to give them that PowerPoint sometime, lecture or TED talk, and explain it to them. But that's never really the time or place. And so, it's important to remember that generally that what they're saying is, I have empathy for fellow human beings. I see suffering. I don't like it. I have heard some language, and I'm repeating that language because it sounded powerful when I heard it, right? Like, let's just give them the benefit of the doubt. It's important to say about anti-Semitism in that kind of language that, for one thing, it's not a binary. You're not either an anti-Semite or not, right? I consider it to be a spectrum, and things, people can sometimes cross a little bit of a line, and it's a gray area, and that's a little bit hard to explain, but it's important for us to remember that people aren't divided into sort of good, bad, evil, and whatever. And also, so it's non-binary, and it's also not a permanent condition. that people are not permanently anti-Semitic, that they learned to say those things from someone, and they can learn to say the thing that is a much more appropriate way of expressing their concern from someone, possibly you. And I think it's always important to remember that, because if, the algorithms out there are designed to get us into this binary thinking of us versus them. But I'm very much of the mindset of, call them in, don't call them out. If all you're ever doing is calling them out, that's unacceptable. You're an anti-Semite, et cetera, et cetera. You're not, I mean, you're right, but you're not going to affect the change that you're aiming to affect, right? So that's where, what you were saying before, about sort of just sort of validating feelings or whatever, using those I statements, sharing your personal story. I feel like that's the way we're going to get past this on college campuses, and maybe in the rest of the world as well.
Yeah, I completely agree. I really like the call them in, not call them out thing. And I think it takes so much active effort to try and overcome the binary division that tends to be inflamed on campuses. And also, I think Jewish students get it from outside the student community. We're kind of encouraged to see everything as us and them, good and bad. And we really need to work to overcome that and have productive conversations. Moving on from talking about universities, I think that's been really helpful and interesting. The AJR obviously does a lot of work with refugees, but can you talk a bit about what you do for next generations, especially third and fourth generations survivors? And
Well, I mentioned before that, we're now really in this process of thinking about the future of the AJR. What do we exist to do when they're no longer first generation survivors and refugees who are our membership base anymore? And we talked about education being part of that. And then another big part of that is reaching out to the children, grandchildren, even great grandchildren right now of the original generation of refugees and survivors from Nazism. And we're kind of asking people of your generation. I don't know if either of you are third generation refugees or survivors, but many who are university age right now, who are asking, well, what would an organization like AJR, where would it fit into your life? What are you looking for from us? Are you looking for, to sort of have a connection with people with a similar background? Because we can provide that for sure. Is it more of a social thing? Is it an educational thing? Do you want talks? Do you want, film screenings? Just little, when was it? November. So, 2 months ago now, I led a group of 10 third and fourth generation refugees who all have an Austrian connection on a 5-day study tour or heritage tour of Vienna. And it was amazing. I volunteered to do it because someone from our office had to go, and I have a Viennese connection. I am, I was probably much older. No, I was a little bit older than most of them, but the age range was 18 to 52. And I thought, well, how's that going to work? And people just got along brilliantly. It felt like family, and that everyone just had this like shared, I don't know, frame of reference and vocabulary. And it was brilliant. And it's also important to say, not everyone was raised with much of a Jewish identity. There was a brother and sister who came who were raised as evangelical Christians, but they're third generation Jewish refugees. Fascinating. And so I don't know. I just feel like we would love for anyone listening to this who has a grandparent who is a survivor or a refugee, or who, if you maybe, is not a grandparent, but a great uncle, great aunt, whatever it was, you have a family connection and you want to be, in a network of people who have that same background. We would love to have you as a member. It's very cheap to join the AJR. It's 25 pounds a year. You get a monthly, we're very old fashioned this way. We still have our monthly print journal. It's like a little magazine that comes in a in the post. Every month we have a weekly email newsletter and all kinds of events and things like that that you can get involved in. So I would very much welcome anyone listening to this to please reach out. Go on ajr.org.uk and look into becoming a member. But it's still at the point where you could be one of the people that helps to shape what it is that we're even doing with these next generations.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's a really important thing for our students to know because they don't know always what the AJR offers or who the AJR are. And it's something that we're trying to work on is, help build that network because that shared history or even just that shared trauma sometimes builds those connections of that, I guess, wider family that while sometimes as Jewish people we feel like we are part of this wider family, that you've got these other like circles of people that just kind of get where you're from, get what you're going through or why how your brain works.
Yeah.
Um,
Can I just say that you just mentioned the term shared trauma. And, this is, I don't, listeners may be familiar with this or not, but like, this is a recognized psychological phenomenon, of inherited trauma. And it's not unique to Jews or Holocaust survivors, but, children and grandchildren of Holocaust survivors, the term of like, a third generation survivor is a little bit of a weird one because it's like you didn't survive a thing. You're the third generation of someone who did. But like getting past the language, it is true that your psychology is affected by the traumas that your grandparents or great grandparents may have experienced. And it's okay to acknowledge that it's affecting you in your life. And it's helpful to share your experiences with people who might have that same thing in their life.
Thank you. And as a final question, because I think we could talk for hours, but we have to let you go and do very important things in the busy days leading up to Holocaust Memorial Day. This year's theme for Holocaust Memorial Day,
Yeah.
we're up to the 80th year since the liberation of Auschwitz-Birkenau, and this year's theme is for a better future. So I guess as a final message, to the people listening, I guess, what does that mean to you? But what kind of how can we work on this for a better future as students, as hopefully the future leaders, the future educators, the people who will lead this learning and understanding about Jewish history and the Holocaust and anti-Semitism and shared trauma and all this kind of stuff. What does for a better future look like?
Every year there's an organization called the Holocaust Memorial Day Trust, and they're the ones that sort of organize the big national network of events, and they come up with the theme for the year. And I'm always impressed that they come up with these themes that I would describe them as helpfully vague, um, which which is to say they can mean sort of whatever you want it to mean. And I don't mean this to I'm not trying to criticize or troll the Holocaust Memorial Day Trust. They do good work. Um, I think this year's theme is a great example of a helpfully vague one, and I mean that in the best educational sense because it really it's a question. It encourages us to reflect upon it. What do we mean? What do we mean when we say for a brighter future? In what ways does learning about the Holocaust inspire or encourage us to create a better future? I do not have one answer to that. And if I had an answer to it, it might be different than yours and to yours, Ruby and Emma. And so I can't give you an answer to, how we work, the one way that we sort of invoke the Holocaust to work for a better future. But of course, at a basic level, that's what education is for. About anything, right? Yes, we need to know about the past simply because it happened. But if that's all we need, that's not what most people would say that education exists for. If that's all that we were doing was just relegating something to the past and saying, well, it happened, too bad. Of course, knowing that human beings are capable of that thing that we talked about earlier. You know, the betrayal of their own neighbors, the murder of people in the name of a racist ideology, of closing borders when people are in need. Knowing that has to exist so that we will aim to ensure that it doesn't happen again. If that's not the case, I mean, we haven't done a great job in the past 80 years, but 80 years isn't a long time in the grand scope of history. So we're still working on it. And I think that that's the thing that we need to commit to do is taking what we've learned about the Holocaust and applying it to our our communities, to our government's policies, to our social networks, our workplaces, our campuses, so on.
Well, that brings us to the end of today's episode of Yalla, the podcast of Jewish students.
We both want to say a big thank you to Alex for joining us and sharing your wisdom and experiences. And thank you to all of our listeners who've tuned in. I think we can all take something away from everything we've talked about today. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe and share it with others who are interested in creating a safer world for all.
You can follow us on UJS_UK on all of our socials for updates on future episodes, events, and opportunities. If anything in this podcast or events on campus have been triggering, don't forget that UJS's 24/7 dedicated welfare support line is open. You can call us on 0207 424 3281 to speak to one of our experienced staff or volunteers. Also, make sure, as this is hopefully being released around Holocaust Memorial Day, that you look on our website for what events are happening near you, where we have Holocaust survivors speaking. And if you are interested in running any events, please get in touch with myself or have a look at what resources and guidance we have on our website.
Tune in next time to hear more incredible stories and meet some amazing people on Yalla, the podcast of Jewish students. But for now, that is goodbye from me.
And goodbye from me. See you all very soon on campus.